What actually makes more sense? Like, let's say you're plateaued and you're already doing 12 to 15 sets. I would go, you know what? Let's try to make each one of those sets higher quality. But if someone's doing 6 to 8 sets and they're plateaued and their intensity is really high already, I am becoming increasingly convinced many of the anecdotes of people who do far better with low volume training have to do with the fact that, Kenny, I just don't care. I don't
Yeah.
care because I want results. That is what my mind is looking at. I look at the limitations of research. I look at the findings. I think about my experiences. I look at what would be true in the world. I look at history and I look at my hundreds of athletes who I've worked with over the years to try to get to the stage. And I go, what is consistently seem to be working best? And I take meticulous notes on myself. I don't want to do high volume. I don't want to do low volume. I want to get bigger.
Transitioning into some of this training stuff that obviously that's always an interesting topic for listeners and of course myself. But how is that right now? Like in the middle of contest, what's that looking like? And how has it transitioned from off season? Is it the same? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And if there's anything valuable there for the listeners as well, obviously that's always good.
Yeah, well, as a brief recap, I was
Yeah.
pushing pretty damn hard in the off season. I was doing closer to what I thought the most I could potentially benefit from rather than what I quote unquote needed to grow or even what might have been sustainable or advised, right?
We
Yeah,
talked about that.
yeah. So I was doing roughly around like 20 sets per muscle group in the lower body and closer to like 30 in my upper body. And mostly very challenging exercises from a local perspective. So I was avoiding things that had like axial loading and like very heavy loads for the most part. I stepped away from powerlifting and bodybuilding hybrid training because I've competed in both forever, fully committed to bodybuilding, but I wasn't pulling from the floor. I wasn't doing barbell squats. I had like feet forward, controlled tempo, Smith machine squats, leg press, RDLs, and still benching, but typically like a less of an arched back, narrower grip. And everything else was cables, dumbbells, and machines. And we're on those movements that I mentioned, the kind of the quote unquote big movements, they were maybe 20% of my volume at most. So, but still a lot and mostly to failure. So, starting most compound sets at like a 2 RIR and working towards a 0 RIR, and then most isolation movements, either starting at the most I can do or actually hitting failure. And then, for time-saving techniques, doing things like rest pause, drop sets, antagonist paired sets. So I was unsurprised based upon a mini cut I ran in my pre-prep positioning phase. I mentioned earlier how like getting over 15% over stage weight's fine, but you don't want to start there. I didn't get that high, but I hit a peak off-season weight of like 91.5 kilos, and I started prep closer to like 88. So during that mini cut from the low 90s into the high 80s, where I just lost about 5 pounds just to get in a good position and then ate at maintenance, then started prep, I saw that, man, I can't sustain this level of work with the same intensity, effort, and without feeling fatigued, and without seeing more drops off in performance, and without feeling like I was needing to do something proactively more frequently, either a deload or changing an exercise into something that felt easier, but I'm trading like a poorer resistance profile out, like changing out an RDL for a back extension or something like that. And I thought, okay, so we need a different plan for prep. And realistically, is this even a good idea? Or am I going to benefit from it during prep, where I'm already doing more than I think is sufficient to grow muscle, but I'm trying to gain as much as I can because I'm competing against the best in the world this next season? Okay, well, let's dial things back. So now I am closer to like instead of like 20 to 30, even slightly higher than 30 sets per week now, I'm closer to like 15 to 25 for everything. And I've changed my split setup. So I'm training every day, but they're shorter sessions, which I think is great for the energy levels I have during prep. And I'm essentially alternating on day 1 through 6 or Monday through Saturday between a full body push, a full body pull. So a full body push, I might come in and do like leg press, leg extension, calf raise, and then I'll do 2 pressing movements and like a lateral raise and triceps. And then a full body pull, I'll come in and I'll do something like a hinge, like an RDL, a hamstring curl, and then I train calves every day because I'm trying to bring these stubborn bad boys up, and my body's very acclimated to it. So I'll do calves. And I also train middle delts every day because I'm trying to bring those bad boys up. So we can just say that every day for Eric Helms is calf and middle delts day. But outside of that, I'll do like a vertical pull, a horizontal pull, and a bicep exercise, and then a hinge and a hamstring exercise. And I'll just alternate those. And then earlier in the week, I'll probably do my heavier, harder compounds like an RDL. Middle of the week, I'll do things that I can recover from, like a back extension, maybe more leg extension sets or sissy squats instead of a leg press or a Smith machine squat. And then later in the week, I might do something like a deadlift from the floor if I feel like I'm chasing that little side quest, or something like another leg press or a hack squat or whatever. And then on my seventh day, it's kind of like my recovery day. I'll come in and I'll do forearms, calves and middle delts because that's every day. A little bit of extra back work because that's kind of a weak point in my physique. And then typically maybe an extra like bicep exercise or something, just depending upon what feels recovered. But that session typically takes 40 minutes. It's only 5 exercises. It's not that crazy, but it's mostly a weak point slash recovery and forearms day. And then I start over again.
Hmm.
So that's been great. If you think about it, I'm getting like 6 to 7 sets every other day on each muscle group, which it's a lot when you add it up over the week, but each individual session is not that challenging, and I can maintain that same intensity. And then if I'm just intelligent in my distribution of harder and easier exercises, when I do and don't go all the way to true momentary failure, and where I kind of pick my spots, it's been far more sustainable while I'm in a calorie deficit and while I'm getting really, really lean. So that's the main thing. It's maybe a 20% reduction in volume and then a distribution that's changed a bit. And it's been working really well. And I think it's a great compromise from me doing everything I possibly could in a fed state at a higher body fat to what's the closest approximation to that I can do while I'm dieting.
Okay. And as far as like you kind of touched on it, but to go a little bit deeper on this, like the connective tissue stress and just obviously you're training upper body every day, right? So what's that like? Are you feeling pretty good joint wise, connective tissue wise, that type of thing?
Yeah, I feel better because it's easier
Oh,
than it was. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I think there's really something to be said for going from push to pull. This is one of those splits that I think is just kind of a hidden gem that people don't think about, like they're on upper lower or legs push pull, but being able to do full body push then full body pull, unless like I could see people not liking it if they're a total pump chaser because you don't
Hmm.
get quite as many sets on one muscle group. But if you come in there and you are training with focus and intensity and high quality and a reasonable rep range, I find even in prep when I'm dieting, I get a pretty good experiential feel of the training and like 1 or 2 sets in. So I really like it. I can come in and get a very good concentrated effort and know that I can push the intensity very high and I'll be fine. Like there's only so much like I recover well. Like if I do 3 sets of incline dumbbells and it drops it on the last one and take that completely to like lengthen partial failure and then do flies after that with each set to failure, I might get a little bit sore the next day, maybe, but then 2 days later I'm ready to go again. So
Ah.
there's no reason not to train again in my mind. And with back, it's even less likely to make me sore. I can come in and train almost all sets to failure, do some kind of horizontal pull, vertical pull. 2 days later, I'm at it again and do one really effortful exercise for biceps. And then when you add all that up, it accumulates to a lot. But each individual session is not that hard, but allows you to be very intentional and very purposeful and have a very high quality of training. So I really like it. I think in the last couple of years, I've really refined the distribution and the organization of training and the exercise selection in such a way that enables me to keep a really, really high quality and then look at turning the volume dial up without necessarily hampering the quality, which I am becoming increasingly convinced many of the anecdotes of people who do far better with low volume training have to do with the fact that when they try to go higher volume, they can't sustain the level of intensity. So they kind of get like this no trade-off for more work and more time invested. And the data actually bears that out if you look at it with a practical lens, if you understand what's going on in the real world versus the lab.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Like, so I
Sure.
want to understand that a little bit better.
Sure. So let's start with just understanding what does the data say. That's pretty clear now. We have, a meta regression on over 1,000 people going back over a few decades of research, studies lasting anywhere from 6 to 24 weeks in most cases, with most of them clustering between 8 to 16. Average study length around 10 weeks, right? Mixture of trained and untrained participants. These aren't bodybuilders, but I think it's still very useful to illustrate a point. And the general thing that it shows is that you do grow more as you do more volume, but the diminishing returns are substantial. And they are such that if you were to go from 5 to 10 sets, that's doubling your volume. That's adding 5 sets. You will have a very noticeable increase in hypertrophy. However, if you were to go from 20 sets to 25 sets, it's the same 5 set increase. That may not be noticeable at all for you. So that same increase in volume becomes progressively less helpful. And it is essentially climbing up an ever steepening hill. And remembering that these studies only last, like I said, a couple months at most. And in many cases, they aren't using ecologically valid training programs, meaning what I described earlier, or your
Mm.
typical upper lower. They might be, not in all cases, but in many, a substantial portion of these studies, just looking at a single muscle group. So this meta regression is more of not telling you what to do in the gym. It's helping you understand the theoretical relationship between volume and hypertrophy. But that doesn't mean that just because we see this relationship in the data, that that's therefore what you should do. Because you're not training just your biceps, you're training your whole body. And you're not just training for 8 weeks, you're going to be training for the rest of your life. And you have to think about not how do I make this muscle grow the most I possibly can over an 8 week period, but what's the best holistic program that works for my life and is sustainable? And, the likelihood of us seeing injury or burnout in an 8 week or 12 week study is low. But if you're doing something that feels unsustainable, even if maybe you could adapt to it, the likelihood is quite high that you'll burn
Mm.
out over 8 years, right? And here's the other thing is that there's a lab effect. It's ironic that in many cases people describe research participants as maybe not training hard or that research studies do easy training. But in the reality is that if you talk to people who go into training studies, especially that are ran properly and are on high volume or high intensity or failure, it is quite literally the hardest they've ever trained in their entire lives. That's because they have a room full of students and professors who lift weights and study lifting weights who are trying to control the environment. And we want to manipulate one variable, not multiple variables. So if we have a group that is doing 10 sets, a group that's doing 20 sets, and a group that's doing 30 sets, we want them to all use the same exercises, rep ranges, loads, proximities to failure, and intent. So you're going to be getting yelled at on each one of these sets. Go, go, go. You got this. Push it as hard as you can to whatever RIR, or more typically, because about 80% of the studies in this meta regression were studies to failure. It's not like what you see in the real world where higher volumes are typically coupled with being further from failure,
Yeah,
while
right.
lower volumes are going to failure. And higher frequencies are typically higher volumes, and lower frequencies typically lower volumes. We have very few pure programs where you're only manipulating one of either volume, intensity, or frequency in the real world, but they're quite common in research because we're trying to isolate the effect of a variable. So in a study, we get this sanitized comparison of what is 10 versus 20 sets to failure for a muscle group for 12 weeks. We rarely get that in the real world. And when we look at observational research, where we're seeing what people do and how they respond with a little less control over some of these variables, there's some interesting things that come out. So when we look at how many reps do people lose set to set to set when they do higher versus lower volume training, it's interesting that they seem to not lose as many reps when they go set to set with higher volumes going to failure versus lower volumes. It should be the opposite. And what's probably happening there, it's not substantial, we're talking a rep or two, but that means that there's probably a subconscious pacing that occurs. This is the same thing that happens when you have someone try to run, you tell them you're going to run 10 miles versus 3 miles, they're going to be slower because they're trying to predict how do I run the 10 miles as fast as possible. And that's going to be a slower average pace so that they don't, bonk, because you can't sprint 10 miles, right? You can only sprint up to like 400 meters. So it's the same thing in training. I think either psychologically or even physically, maybe they're thinking about what is the most I can do on each set if I need to get through X number of sets. So in controlled research, we can have that lab effect that maintains the intensity. But I think in the real world, what often happens is someone will try to increase their volume and they typically do it too quickly, and they don't give
True.
it enough time to adapt. They don't
That's true.
experience the repeated bout effect. They go, oh, shit, let me try this new program. I just finished this low volume one. Let me give this high volume one a shot. It blows them out of the water. They end up doubling their volume. They don't actually think about the actual changes in number of sets or the exercises, and they burn out, and that's it, and they never really give it a chance, and they don't adapt. So ultimately, I think we need to understand that there's a time and a place where it makes more sense to focus on proximity to failure or intensity and more sense to focus on volume. So if we know that if you're currently at, say, 6 to 8 sets per muscle group, that going up to, say, 12 to 15, that's again, almost doubling your volume, is going to have a far greater effect than if you went from 12 to 15 up to, say, 20. Even though both are increasing by 8 sets because you're getting these diminishing returns, what actually makes more sense? Like, let's say you're plateaued and you're already doing 12 to 15 sets. I would go, you know what? Let's try to make each one of those sets higher quality. But if someone's doing 6 to 8 sets and they're plateaued and their intensity is really high already, and we
Right.
know they're going to have those initial sets count for more, I'm going to go, let's try to add a couple sets.
Right.
So, and that's not the typical conversation you get when you get people who are very ideological in terms of their volume and their intensity. They kind of buy into a certain philosophy or ideology or person, if I'm frankly honest.
Person. Yeah.
Yeah. And what it really comes down to is what is the most likely variable that's going to benefit you the most? And if you're already on a high volume program, you're more likely to be pacing, meaning that you're not as close to failure as you think you are. You're choosing lower stress exercises. You're pushing the recovery capacity that you might be able to have. I want to audit and see, all right, are you actually training as hard as you think you are? And if the answer is no, then the answer is not more volume. It may even be a slight reduction if we can increase your intensity. So when someone comes to me and they're doing, say, 15 plus sets per muscle group, the first thing I'm interested in is to ask them is, hey, can you send me your videos? If someone is coming to me and they're doing 5 to 10 sets, the first question I have is, do you have any more time to train? Are you actually that? Do you need to be doing only 5 to 10 sets? How much time are you resting? How much time are you socializing? Because a motivated person doing 5 to 10 sets, even to momentary failure per week, per muscle group, that should take them like 2 hours. And maybe that's all they have. Then awesome. Fantastic. Right? We'll work on exercise selection. We'll work on nutrition. But if someone is busting their ass and they're getting all their workout done in 2 hours and they're plateaued, let's get another day. I mean, it's very low time investment to get to something like 8 to 15 sets, in my opinion, for most people, unless they're incredibly busy.
And you were saying 5 to 10 sets per workout? Is that what you were referring to there?
Per muscle
Like
group per week.
per muscle group per week. And the 2 hours, like, oh, a
A
workout.
week.
A week. Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
then
sorry.
that's yeah.
Everything I said in context of that of the research is sets per week per muscle group and using what's described as a fractional counting method. So bench, one set would be one set for chest and half a set for triceps because it's an indirect. Yeah.
Right, right. These are interesting conversations, especially with the ideology and of course people latching on to what they have a guru, right? They are if they've fallen in love, right? That's literally what it's
Unfortunately.
become, right? And it can cloud judgment. It can cloud your ability to learn and grow and actually improve, right, over time. Because you gave a great example about the 6 to 8 sets example, and you take someone who's really focused on hit or high intensity training, and they'll think I have to do less. And then sometimes, you know, I'm sure you've come across this, Eric, where you have people who preach high intensity training. They talk about all the amazing gains that they've gotten, but sometimes a lot of these people who are talking, maybe that's true, but it's like there's no profile, and they're usually the ones attacking people who are doing higher volumes. It's gotten kind of out of hand actually on social media, just in general. And that's why this conversation tends to pop up a lot because how could it not when it's constantly coming into the comment section of even like longevity muscle, right? Like with the YouTube videos. And I think, okay, we're talking about an individual who's offering perspective on what they've done to build their physique and in a lot of cases to become a world champion and who is natural, right? So I don't know if you have any initial thoughts there. You want to chime in or we can move on. It's up to you.
I think people are really doing themselves a disservice if they're not aware of history, the history of bodybuilding. I think when you get exposed to silos of information, it really makes you not be aware of the limits of what have been done. And also the beautiful thing of the history of bodybuilding, and it'd be great for you to get Connor Heffernan on sometime to talk about this, is that it wasn't the history of just bodybuilding if you go back far enough. It was the history of weightlifting, powerlifting, and physical culture. And the norms of what was done, and no one thought about it, no one questioned it. It wasn't weird and it was easy to do. If we go back to the vaudeville era, we're talking like Eugen Sandow. Like these are people who are on the road doing strength exposés and hand balancing and gymnastics every day to make money to live. They're performing strength feats daily sometimes. And then when we talk about the era in the early 1900s up to like the 1940s, where weightlifting, strength sport, and bodybuilding were all one and the same, people competed in both, the common training methods were either alternating upper lower splits or full body training 4, 5, 6 times a week, you know? And it wasn't until like Nautilus came out and the marketing of Arthur Jones that the concept of high intensity training came in. And this is also right around the time that anabolic steroids hit the shelves, you know, and that's not me saying that, oh, HIIT only works. I'm not like trying to flip the script because people are like, oh, high volume only works if you're on drugs. I'm not saying, well, no, high intensity only works if you're on drugs. But
That's funny because you depends on who you come across and what they're preaching. It's like, yeah, you'll hear both sides of that. Or, oh, you can only
yeah,
recover from high. If anyone who's natural and is doing high volume is not natural, and anyone who's natural and got a great physique doing like twice a week training is not natural. And it's like, okay, nobody's natural, nobody's training, and nobody's got a great physique. That's where we've come down to, I think.
that that is. It's the perennial move of the ideologue is if I can't win this argument, I'm just gonna tip over. I'll poison the well. I'm gonna tip over the table. Like, you know what? Can I sit at the cool kids table? Can I make the cool kids table mine? No, then screw this table. Let me kick it over. Tables are bullshit. So, yeah, as soon as someone resorts to that, you kind of know that they're not open to thinking about this differently, or they just haven't been in the game long enough. You know,
True.
like ideology doesn't survive in the capitalist mindset of a competitor. I'll tell you what, one thing that I really love is that I'm still actively competing and that I'm not just a researcher or I'm not just a content creator because I think it's easy to fall in love with your theories and hypotheses when you don't have skin in the game, you know?
Gotcha.
But when I am actually hell-bent and psychotically focused on trying to be the best version of myself, Kenny, I just don't care. I don't
Yeah.
care. I don't care whether high volume works or low volume works. I don't care if I was convinced by the data and my own experience that a low protein diet would grow muscle better, I'd be on that dear low protein diet. You know what I'm saying? Because I want results.
Right.
And that is what my mind is looking at. I look at the limitations of research. I look at the findings. I think about my experiences. I look at what would be true in the world. I look at history and I look at my hundreds of athletes who I've worked with over the years to try to get to the stage. And I go, what is consistently seem to be working best? And I take meticulous notes on myself and I do not care. I don't care. I don't want to do high volume. I don't want to do low volume. I want to get bigger. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Right.
So I think that's something that has helped me be more objective. It's helped me be honestly, frankly, just more Machiavellian about this. I am very happy to let go. Like I have trained in ways that I look back on and go, that was counterproductive. I lost muscle. Some people, and even myself as a younger person, would not be able to admit that. Like, oh, I
Mm.
bet on the wrong horse. I made an error. I was doing something stupid. And not that I really think it's stupid. I think I was just experimenting and it wasn't working very well.
Sure.
But so I am just not swayed when I see kind of these relatively siloed perspectives. And like in the really, really high intensity camp, you get people who almost treat the body like it's fragile. You know,
Mm.
like how could someone you can't recover from all that? I'm like, have you ever even seen a CrossFit competition? You
Yeah.
know, like and then they start to ascribe magical effects of drugs. You know, like they make us a different species. Like all of a sudden now, the energy balance doesn't matter. You know, like muscle damage is not a thing. You take drugs, you can do anything. And it's just not true. And they're not even logically consistent. They're happy to be like, oh no, you can only do, you know, like, oh, drugs make that possible. By the way, Dorian Yates is awesome. I'm like, okay, hold on. Like, help
Right.
me out here. Help me
Yeah.
out here.
Yeah.
Like, can you hold contradicting, statements just to hold on to your biases that well? Then clearly you're not a rational actor, and I don't really care what you have to say.
That is so, like, I've come across real world scenarios, like in the trenches, speaking with people at the gyms, at facilities I've worked at. And it's funny because you'll say things like, oh, you know what? I did that super slow stuff. That didn't work for me. Like, I didn't build any muscle doing that. And then the first initial comment will be, well, you didn't do it right then. And it's like, really? How do you know? Like, were you there with me doing it? Regardless of if I did or didn't, the fact that you assume that tells me that you're not actually interested in learning about my experience. You've made up your mind on what you think that, or not even what you think. You've just made up your mind. Like, this is what it is. And that's it.
Kenny, your experience is a threat to them, not an
Right.
opportunity to learn. They have a worldview that they want to hold on to, and for whatever reason, they feel less safe, or less sure of themselves, or less confident, or have a sense of a loss of identity when that worldview is threatened. So something that could be interpreted as evidence that I could learn from and learn one new thing is actually a threat to an identity or a worldview, and it gets rejected out of hand. There's an immediate search for, okay, how can I know this isn't true? You probably didn't try hard. You'll get no indication of curiosity, which is what you would actually want to see. Really? Why did super slow training work really well for me and not this guy? I got to ask. That would be the response of someone
Right.
who is curious and is open to learning. But if that's rarely the response when you get these people, and I think one thing, so we don't just blackpill ourselves on how shitty the internet is to
Great.
remember that
Yeah. Good
um,
idea. Good idea, Eric.
yeah,
Thank you. Because
this has
I'm bad
always
at that
been, yeah.
sometimes.
Of course, we have a negativity bias as humans. It's how we stay alive. All mammals have this. You need to be very attuned to the potential proverbial wolf in sheep's clothing. That broken twig in the forest 9 out of 10 times, it's not going to be a tiger. But the one time it is and you don't notice it, you're dead. All right.
Mm.
And now you don't pass on your genetic lineage, and we aren't here talking on Zoom. So we notice the negative comments more. Also, the people with the most loud, controversial opinions who have this kind of dogmatic belief set are more likely to comment. The comment section itself is an unbiased perspective of what's out there. There's going to be, let's say, 1,000 views on a video and 30 comments, right? There are 1,000 people who viewed it and liked it.
Mm.
Or maybe there's, whatever the proportion are. There's a huge silent majority of people who are just going, oh, that's interesting. Let me file that away and think about it. And then there's going to be people who really just have the need to share their opinion. These are the same people who need to put everything on their bumper sticker, right? Like, you need to know who I voted for 12 years ago. You need to know that I am part of this association and that my child was student of the month sometime 6 months ago. I am my beliefs, I am my identity, and I need you to be victim to my loud screaming. That's a much higher, not everyone in the comments, obviously, but that's a much
Mm.
higher proportion of the people who are in the comments, while most of the rational actors who are just there to learn and consume educational content are happy to give you a click, might send you a private message, are going to watch and listen, and that's about it. So I think you have to remind yourself of that. You don't want to dismiss everything. It's also a pathway towards dismissal and not learning on the content creator's part. Like,
True.
you do want to pay some attention to the feedback you get from the people you're trying to serve ultimately. But just be aware that the counterculture crazy narrative of no, you just need one set to failure every fortnight to grow, it catches the eye because it's counterintuitive. It's different to what the majority of people do and have said works. It's extreme and it makes you feel like almost
Superior
conspiracy-esque. Yes,
and
it makes you feel like
superior.
you have the answer and everyone else does not, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. That's a great point, actually. And I'm glad you did bring that up because obviously there's a lot of positives as well from a content creator side, let's just say, that that's being received as well. But also, what as you know, of course, and but also even like from what we were discussing as far as like if you do have this way of going about it and that motivates you and it's an actual you feel like it's actually giving you a positive in your life and you're not about how should I put this? It hasn't become a negative thing. At least you've questioned it. Let's put it that way. You're open to learning. You're not like my way is better or something like this for everybody in general, right? Well then, so that's I think there's a positive to that as well. It's motivating this person. It's keeps them on track towards their goals. But as soon as it goes into the direction that we spoke about, then obviously that's a different conversation, right? So
Yes.
yeah,
And the last thing I'll say on the specific topic of high intensity training is that I think many of the people who benefit from it really fell in love with it and that it was a positive thing in their lives. They may not be very good at extrapolating other people's experience over their own, which is a common thing.
sure.
It takes wisdom and life experience and a certain type of personality to put yourself in other people's shoes versus kind of be judgmental and think everyone has the same experience as you. A lot of people, because you talk to competitive bodybuilders, but a lot of your audience are not competitive
That's
bodybuilders.
it.
My point about high intensity training is that many times the people who have a great experience with it, they weren't training as hard as, and this is not true of just people in HIT camp. Most people don't train hard enough, period. And they would get a tremendous benefit from actually training close to even, or even all the way to failure. And it is true. The closer you get to failure, the more stimulative that individual set will be, period. It's also true that if you do more of those sets, it's a higher dose of that same
Right.
thing, right? And you could say, hey, great, more failure training is good. I could even paint that as a positive for the HIT crowd, right? But most people are not trying to grow as much as they possibly can. They're trying to grow as much as they possibly can within the constraints of their lives and what
Yes.
is feasible,
That's
enjoyable.
facts.
And the thing about Arthur Jones, you can say a lot of negative things about him because there's a lot of negative things about him if you look at the history, is that he marketed HIT in a really effective but not dishonest way. You can take 20 minutes and get incredible results compared to what you've been doing per week. If you truly give me like a couple, like a handful of all out to failure sets on these machines that allow you to do that safely, that don't require a whole lot of skill, you right out the box, general person who's interested in building muscle in America can build a tremendous amount of muscle, and you don't need to be exercising for hours like you see these bodybuilders do. That is true. The claim was not you can become Mr. Olympia by training 20
Right.
minutes a week,
There it
right?
is. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And And I think what you're getting is you're going to get someone who's talking about how did I build the best, most competitive physique to compete at the world championship level or the pro level or whatever level they can get to or their own history versus someone who the important thing for them was focusing on intensity and taking those handful of sets they do per week and actually making them effective. And it was a monumental change. Their physique transformed. Those two experiences can coexist, but you're getting people talking across each other. If I told you from an investment standpoint, you know what? If you did 30 minutes of work, you could get this 100% payoff. But if you did 300 minutes of work, you could get 150% payoff. They'd be like, that's a terrible idea. But if you told that to someone who's trying to maximize everything, they'd take it every time. Like I said, you tell a competitive bodybuilder, I'm going to go from 20 to 25 sets, you might get a very small increase in hypertrophy. They're great, awesome. You tell someone who only has the time to do 10 sets per week, that if they get up to 25 sets, they could make better progress. They go, well, that's off the table for me. I'm not willing to do that. It's not worth it. So there is a huge difference in goal of someone who's trying to maximize a fixed amount of time versus someone who's trying to maximize regardless of the poorer and poorer and poorer return on investment. From an efficiency standpoint, I'm losing big time, Kenny. And if someone wanted to make that argument, I'm happy to do it. They're like, dude, I can make 80% of the gains you're making doing half the work. I'm like, yes, you can, but I need to make 100% of the gains that I can make because I'm getting on stage naked. If I wasn't, then I'd be on board.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, exactly. And that's what I was just gonna say this, like when you're talking about the average person, or I don't even want to phrase it like this. When we reference it relative to the people who are commenting in the way that we had talked about, that's better. When you're watching a video of yourself or Oscar Moscat or Gary Amlinger, and they're doing what they're doing, it's about understanding where, how, and if that even applies to you, and what might or probably doesn't apply to you in your life circumstances, and you don't live their life. Like I was talking about this with Jeff Alberts. We recently spoke. We were talking about the fact that like when I went to visit Gary in Thailand, like that is his life. He moved there to be because his goal is to become a world champion, and he wants to dedicate his entire life to that. And in going to Thailand, it's allowed him to live a lifestyle where he could effectively do that. And I saw it. I saw it. We spoke about it. So it's like you don't live that life. So of course you're not gonna like understand that. You don't live his life, right? So and you're not even open to hearing his story either when we spoke, right? Like some of these comments. But anyways, I just wanted to throw that in there. And
yeah,
we're gonna
I'll
cut
say
off.
one last thing.
And
One
then
last thing.
okay.
Like with Olympians, we're totally happy to accept that they're doing crazy things to get the results they have. But because everyone lifts, but not everyone's a professional bodybuilder, we struggle with that and we need to have a judgment on it because we think our experience is more relevant. But you're a swimmer who's doing 10,000, hours of swimming over a given time period. You're like, oh, cool.
I love that. Thank you for that. And I hope that resonates with those of you listening who might have thought differently. Hopefully that hits home.